Hi folks, welcome. We're on pre-show mode just for a moment or two. Hope everybody's well. Nice to see so many people on already. And we're going to have a very interesting conversation with Gerard and Robbie. Just to show you what's going on here in the background. It's the studio. Robbie's there showing because he's the last person who spoke. It switches automatically. Whoever speaks shows in the screen, but Gerard's in there somewhere as well. And just to say that the dogs aren't here tonight, the reason is that we've got quite warm temperatures and the windows open, and they bark every time they hear somebody go past. So they're actually in a separate room. So no doggies tonight, but never mind. That'll not be a major problem. And of course, as normal, looking forward to your questions. We'll start the show formally in just a second or two as we hit 8 p.m. And we expect to go for about an hour and a half or so, maybe slightly longer if the conversation gets really heated. Anyway, we've hit 8 p.m., pre-show off. I'm going to start the show. I'll be back in just a moment. Well, good evening and welcome to the live stream here on the 11th of August 2026, almost in October, wishing my time away. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on this evening. Thanks for taking time out of your Tuesday evening. Very important conversation this, because of course the political landscape in Australia is, well, a bit chaotic at the moment. So having a conversation about where it might go is really important. Just before I bring Robbie and Gerard in, just want to remind you that we're not providing specific financial or legal or anything advice. This is a general conversation. We do moderate the chat, so please play nice. And we're also looking to get your questions and comments as we go. If you use that Walk the World DFA, that'll get into my queue. I've enabled Super Chat so you can get your question to the top of the list, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Thanks for all those who support us via Patreon, PayPal, or even Super Chat. It really makes a huge difference. We don't do this for profit. We do this because there's a really important conversation to be had. Right, well, let's get started straight away. And welcome Robbie first. Hi, Robbie. Nice to see you back.
Hi, Martin. Very good to be back. Thanks for hosting this tonight.
Well, I think it'll be great fun. And Gerard, I think if you speak, you should pop up too.
Hi, Martin. How you going? Good to see you.
Yeah, lovely to see you again, Gerard. And we've had a good few conversations over the years, but I actually think of all the conversations, this potentially is the most critical conversation, because the landscape in Australia says we need to do things differently.
Oh, that's correct. Yeah, we've needed to do things differently for a long time. The difference now is that One Nation's come along, and I think given the coalition a big touch up, and Labor now starting to become worried as well. So, with three parties out there now, three major parties out there now, and even the Greens polling 14%. So, if Labor was to start going backwards, the Greens would, if they were to get another 5 or 6%, they'd suddenly be in the 20s, and then you'd have a four-way split. But all of this, of course, is a means to an end, and the end is who has the best solutions to fix the mess that Australia's got in. And in order to understand how, what are the best solutions, you need to really understand how we got here in the first place. And of course, that was all, in my view, started in the back in the 80s under the Hawke-Keating government and continued by the Howard government. It's not a single sort of era, but I think the 20 years between 1983 and 2000, there was some serious policy implementation that's had a devastating impact on the direction that this country's heading in.
Yes, and I'm reminded of Andy Burnham, just taken over as the PM in the UK, and he made a couple of really interesting comments. The first was, the political system has been broken for the last 40 years or so in the UK. It's been too centralised, it's not enough devolved, and it's not actually aligned to the interests of ordinary people. And I thought, well, you could actually say precisely the same about the Australian political system too, that effectively the political system has been focusing on things that are actually going against ordinary people and ordinary businesses. And that, for me, is why this is an important conversation. We need to find a different path.
That's right.
Yeah.
But, sorry, Robbie. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, sorry to interrupt, Gerard. You and I, Martin, I remember the very first time we spoke in 2018 and did an interview, a podcast like this. we talked about that same history of neoliberalism that took our economy off the path that was working and functional and took it down this path to this, obsession with privatizing everything and profits. And our party, we've been going for 38 years. We fought it the whole way, right? We fought it from the late 80s onwards, without any success, of course. But that's when, in 2019, I met Gerard in federal parliament. The best anti-neoliberal I ever met in parliament happened to be a liberal, happened to be a liberal senator. And 7 years later, we're joining forces with him because we have always seen that this is what has to be addressed. We've got to see where we went wrong, where as a country we lost our way, and get back on track.
Yeah, and one of the interesting observations, and it's a question that came in before the show, I've got quite a few questions that people threw me earlier, was about the political funding and the fact that the major parties these days seem to be funded, on the Liberal side by big business, probably on the other side perhaps by the unions, and even some of the other opposition or third parties by big money from big individuals. So to what extent is politics a question of funding, really?
Look, fundings, and look, as we're, Robbie and myself, we're now combined, so we have to talk about funding as well. The discussion around funding, it's a reality that we have to face, whether we like it or not. And I guess it's a question of two evils. Which one's the lesser one? Do you get taxpayer funding, or do you rely on the private sector for funding, or do you ban core flutes, how to vote cards, and to a degree, some of this, I think is doable. But like I, as someone here who's trying to, we go out of our way to try and, and we're not, we don't have a lot of money by any means. We're living off the smell of an oily rag. It is very hard. What funding does do is it makes it very difficult in the existing funding laws where they cut funding off at 4% of the vote. They're basically ensuring that minor parties can never become major parties. So that's an issue. But funding, can I say though, and obviously I was a senator for 6 years, politicians aren't receiving bags of cash. I think one of the reasons it's their paycheck that influences them. So if they feel as though if they don't follow the party line, they're going to lose their job, that's all they need. It's the actual paycheck. And the bureaucracy is the same. Like a lot of bureaucrats create rules purely to keep themselves in a job. So they're just, you can argue that the bureaucrats are just as corrupt because they become hammers looking for nails, in the sense that if they were to finish their project and say, project completed, mission accomplished, they'd be out of a job. So they're always going to look or create a crisis or, create a need for themselves, right? So the urge for self-instinct versus doing the right thing, that's what do you call, self-survival as well. So we need to be cognizant of that. What we're lacking, in my view, are politicians who actually understand how the world works and have the knowledge of how the economy works, and then have the conviction to actually put forward solutions, and then the ability to win the argument when they put forward solutions. And I mean, we've seen this at the moment with Labor's CGT changes. I think they've completely botched up the sale of it. I personally don't have a problem with getting rid of the 50% CGT discount, but that's on the condition, and this is the big condition, is that had they lowered income tax rates or marginal tax rates on all income. So rather than just increase the tax rate on capital gains, what they should have done was lower the marginal rate of tax to offset that gain, so that the overall rate of tax, or the tax take, for example, isn't actually higher, but what you're doing is that you're ensuring that all forms of income are taxed equally. But, all they've given is a $275 rebate that comes, I think, annually at the end of the year, which for most people isn't worth, it's $5 a week. It's not worth the effort. Whereas we need significant income tax cuts in this country to take pressure off the working class. So look, money in politics, money in the world, money is what makes the world go round. Do we need greater transparency? Yes. around it. There's no doubt in my view that at the big end of town where the big donations come in, I think they do have influence. The smaller donations, most members of minor parties wouldn't be influenced by smaller donors. And then with the bigger donors, they don't even go to the backbenchers. They just go straight to the ministers. And even then the ministers would be led, be told what to do. My experience in Parliament is there's very few decision makers. Ultimately, it's the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, maybe the Finance Minister, the leader of the National Party, and maybe one or two other key leaders. So even if you're a minister, and even a cabinet minister, and as Matt Canavan famously said when he stood down from cabinet, he said, "No, I can hear you scream in cabinet." And I remember the week that he stood down, I sent him a text message and said, "Matt, we can't have you leaving cabinet. You're one of the few good guys in there." And he said, "Well, all we do in there is watch PowerPoint presentations anyway." Oh. So, the decisions are made by such a small group of people. It doesn't impact a lot of the politicians. They just follow the narrative because they're too scared to speak up. And then lose their jobs accordingly. It's the jobs that actually. So what you really want are people that want to go in there and don't care about their jobs and keeping their jobs. But then, there's other people wealthy politicians who are in there that don't need to be a senator or an MP, because they're already wealthy, but they still toe the line because they want to become ministers or they like the position. So I would argue that in many respects it comes back to integrity and ethics. And as we've seen in the National Corruption Commission just recently, I think it was Brereton, he had to step down because he didn't declare a conflict of interest to do with robo-debt, I believe. I'll stand to be corrected on that. But
robo-debt.
Yet again, and I don't think the National Corruption Commission has yet convicted anyone. So, you can have all the checks and balances in the world too, but if they don't prosecute and do their job, and, CGA comes to mind here, many of these so-called independent authorities are now just captured by the private sector. So, it's just a question of, and this is why, what we're trying to do in our party is get a strong grassroots membership that will hold the existing MPs, if we ever get any, to account through the pre-selection process. Because this is where the Liberal Party has fallen in on itself. It stopped holding pre-selections for many of its sitting MPs, which has cut the opinion or the accountability of the parliamentary party has been removed from the membership. And that is why, the Labor Party has always been a top-down structure, but that's why I believe having a grassroots system is so important, because if the MP you vote for in pre-selection stops doing what they say they were going to do and upholding the party values, you've got to have that pre-selection process inside a party to hold them accountable if they don't.
And Martin, it's also the more involvement the public has in political parties, it's the best insurance against the corruption of big money. Right, get involved in the political process yourself. If you can we're trying to create a new party and a new movement here, and we want people to join us. Right, get involved, be part of that, and then the numbers of everyday people being involved in politics is an excellent counterweight against the influence of big money.
Well, I've said for some time. That to my mind, you have this top-down, centralised "thou shalt" coming down from the political machine, and ordinary people and businesses are at the bottom, and they're being completely sort of crushed by a lot of those decisions. You need to turn the whole thing on its head and say, no, actually the political parties should be supporting. It's like an inverted triangle, right? The people are at the top, and the political system and process should be enabling and supporting them, because that's what actually politics should be about. It should be about enabling people to do the things that they need to do to get on in their lives, rather than actually the other way around. Now, that is a complete turnaround from the centralized push down that we're seeing at the moment. So that for me and that says the voice of the people. And I created a panel, a show years ago called "In the Interests of the People." Right? I think the interests of the people have to come first here. And that, for me, is the first fundamental switch that I think we need to make if we're actually to be able to actually progress.
Absolutely,
Agree.
Martin. And yeah, the best way to counteract the mainstream media narrative is through word of mouth. And this is what I say to our members. They often say, Gerard, how can we help? And I said, look, just share posts on social media, talk to your friends and family about our policies. The podcast that I've been on in the last month, we've had some strong membership uptake from that. That hasn't cost us anything in terms, and like this podcast tonight, right? Like, so if you're out there listening and you like our policies, just talking about it and spreading it around. That's the best way to break the power of the mainstream / establishment narrative as well, because the world is run by those who turn up. And if, your democracy is only ever as strong as those who do turn up and get involved. And that's what we've got to do. If we add up the numbers of people in Australia that are involved in a political party, I think it's 50,000 in the Labor Party. I think One Nation's matching that now, give or take 10,000. So that's 100,000. The Liberals coalition's down to about 40,000, I believe. And there's not more than 60,000 between the Greens and the other minor parties. So there's less than 200,000 people involved in a political party in a country of a population of 28 million people. So it's less than 1%. So, we've got to hope that, people, if they want to change things, have to get involved.
Now, the other thing that I think it's worth reflecting on is the latest polls suggest that there are a lot of people who are voting against something. So they're voting against the existing incumbent and indeed the existing opposition parties, and, a plague on both your houses. So actually, it doesn't really matter what the policies are that other people are actually putting out there, because I want to show my opposition to the people who are currently in power. And it seems to me there's a danger of voting just against something, simply because if you're not careful, what you can end up doing is effectively implicitly accepting a range of policies which may be vague, may be unclear, and may be partially formed. So is it important to understand what we're voting for?
Yeah, absolutely. You're going to run into huge trouble quite easily if it's just a rage-driven vote. Now, there's a silver lining to it, of course, because we do need to break this uni-party hold, and you're definitely seeing that happening in the polls, and we saw the polls borne out in the South Australian election, and so since 2008, there'd been the steady decline in the major party vote, Labor coalition vote, and this year it's fallen off a cliff. So finally, Australians are deciding that a plague on both your houses, but if you want to actually fix something, you've got to get proper solutions in place, and this is where. Sometimes I feel like a bit of a gripe up, but I know with the work that our party has done for many years, and we'll talk about our policies here tonight, we've worked very hard to advocate policy solutions, positive policy solutions always. And what you see and I tend to blame the media as much as anyone else for it. What you see with the media is a filtering of voices like ours out of the popular perception, and a focus on just the voices that are just giving them the populist line, the rage bait, etc. Because one might argue that that's more easily controlled as well at the end of the day, and you can sometimes see some shenanigans around that. But do the public want change? They do want change. That's absolutely true. So let's actually look at the solutions that will bring that change. And our party has, we've essentially got a commitment that we are going to put those economic solutions, up front, first, second, and third, so that people always have a chance to see, okay, this is how things can be different.
Right. And you talk about economic solutions. One of the critical questions that came up through before the show came out was the cost of living. People are saying things like, I haven't got a way of navigating through the cost of living. Inflation's high, everything's costing more, energy, et cetera, et cetera. Cost of living seems to me to be right at the heart of what needs to be addressed, and the existing governments have failed, I think, to address it.
Yeah, that's right, Martin. And this has been a long time coming, as a result of the policies in the 1980s. And we'll we'll talk about it because there's a couple of issues here. What the governments have been doing in terms of cost of living is offering short-term handouts that are cyclical in nature. But what we also need to do is make structural reforms as well. And that's what our policy slogan is: the solutions for today and the vision for tomorrow. The first thing we can do is cut taxes by $4,000 to make sure, at the bottom end of the scale, to make sure all workers get a $4,000 tax cut. So that should provide immediate cash flow for those people struggling. Second thing we want to do is pay childcare directly to parents, because yet again, that will provide more relief to the family budget. And the third thing we want to do is we want to allow people to keep their wages in the form, that's currently 12% of their wages currently sent off to superannuation funds. Look, there's no point having money in super if you can't make ends meet today and you can't, keep a roof over your head, right? But we've got to put the horse before the cart. So we've got 3 policies that will provide immediate cost of living relief, and with the exception of the first policy, which is expensive, but we've got ways to fund that. But we also need to deal with the long-term structural issue, right? And what are those issues is obviously excess government spending and waste, the duplication of state and federal government departments like the environment, education, health. We need to streamline all that. The second thing we need to do is stop the leakage of profits offshore. There is too much capital flight out of this country. The double speak from politicians over the last 40 years that we need to attract foreign capital while saying nothing about the domestic capital flight out of our country is just the gross hypocrisy and grinds my gears. So we want to lift withholding taxes on profits sent offshore so that we can lower taxes here again in Australia. And of course, the third thing we can do is start building infrastructure and fund the construction of infrastructure. And that'll do a couple of things. First of all, by increasing the supply of infrastructure that provides essential services, power stations to provide power, dams to provide water for farmers, and hydropower. Better roads, better transport systems like toll roads, ports, airports. We will lower the cost of doing business because we're increasing the supply of those business inputs. But secondly, that will, if the government owns this, it will generate recurring revenue, particularly for state governments to help pay for schools and hospitals. And by increasing, so what we're doing is we're building up our asset base again to actually start generating new income. Because we often talk about the federal government $1 trillion debt. The combined state government debt isn't that far behind, and they have much fewer levers than the federal government to pay that debt off. So we've got policies, infrastructure bank to build, fund the construction of profit centre infrastructure. By profit centre infrastructure, I'm talking about the sort of infrastructure that makes money. We want to increase the rate of withholding tax on profits offshore. We want to bring back a national government insurance office that will actually eliminate the cost of reinsurance that's paid offshore. We want to standardise workers' compensation across the country so that businesses don't have to pay 6 different lots of workers' compensation to 6 different state governments. And we want to streamline the rules and regulations between state and federal governments so that businesses can get on with the business of making money and not be bogged down in compliance.
Yeah, well, it's a big agenda and it's a totally appropriate agenda. One other factor, of course, you mentioned superannuation. It's interesting to me that the PM has been talking about offering that superannuation pool across to the US, right? Rather than actually allowing perhaps people to get more access themselves. And in fact, there's in the chat, somebody said, well, if I had access to my super, I could actually go buy a house. The superannuation system seems to have been built to support certain interests, but not ordinary people's interests.
Well, you can go on YouTube and find Bob Hawke's 1990 election ad where he promised that superannuation would be used to invest in infrastructure in Australia. He said we could develop Australia without foreign debt. That's what he actually said in the ad. 36 years later, we've got $4 trillion in super. We've got trillions in foreign debt, and we're sending our super offshore. There's a book that I read quite a while ago now called Paul Keating's. It's called Unfinished Business: Paul Keating's Interrupted Revolution. And it was about the push to the revolution won't be finished until the super contribution is up to 15%. That was the original plan, to get up to 15%. I think it's at 12% now. And this book, which was written by a real Keating admirer, a journalist named David Love, he actually lays out in the book how there's one section there where he said Keating saw superannuation as a way to create a pool so that banks like Macquarie Bank could be funded to go and buy infrastructure overseas. Now, that's not what the Australian people were told. That's not what we were sold with this system. So young people are paying into super and they can't afford to save for a house, and we've got all these trillions of dollars being, accumulated and earning fees for paper pushers, essentially. And at the end of the day, as Gerard likes to point out, it actually hasn't even worked for the policy reasons it was put up, which is to replace the pension. It's not even working from that standpoint. So at a certain point, you got to call it and say, this ain't working. What would happen if it was voluntary and people could actually buy a house instead? I think we'd be much better off.
Yeah, very interesting. And, some people are saying, well, the superannuation works for me, So choice is perhaps the way to think about it, but it does seem to be a huge drain. There's a huge amount of fees taken out by the financial players in the superannuation system every year, of course. So it seems to me
$40 billion.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
right.
It's estimated to be 1% of costs under management.
Yeah. So that's another set of fees. And by the way, the disclosure in superannuation is pretty awful, which means you quite often can't even see all the fees that are there and all of those things. Now, one of the other interesting questions that I got again before the show, and Johnny actually threw this in, the existing banking system and monetary system seems very much to be designed to protect the status quo. And his question was, how would you change it to make it more aligned to the interests of the people?
Well, that's quite easy, to just bring back a public bank like we used to with the Commonwealth Bank. I mean, I'm a big believer when it comes to essential services, and banking services is an essential service, that the best model you can have is obviously you have a public bank, we have public hospitals, we have public schools, and then you have private schools, private hospitals, and private banks. So I believe, for example, had the Commonwealth remained a public bank, there's no way that they would have ever shut down branches in country towns, for example. Right, so that's the first thing we can do, and it's very important we keep branches open to keep access to cash available. Older people, people who struggle with English. There's many people that still need to access a bank teller. I'm not saying that the need for cash and that hasn't declined. It has, but we can look at consolidating various roles, including insurance, post office services, and even Centrelink services, all into a one-stop government shop that provides all of those things if we need to streamline things. If that means we're going to keep our post offices, our banks open and available, let's do that. We don't need 4 different buildings in town, put it all in one bank. Now, the other thing obviously we need to do is when it comes to monetary policy itself, for the last, I couldn't tell you when, I think it was in the late 70s, 80s, we've only ever used qualitative easing to try and control inflation. So you've got 3 levers when it comes to managing monetary policy: qualitative easing, which is where you change the price of money or you manipulate interest rates. And that's what our unelected bureaucrats at the RBA are given the powers to do. So much for democracy. But there's 2 other levers you can use as well. One is macroprudential controls. So we've seen the relaxation of macroprudential controls throughout the last 40 years. Anthony Albanese this year, or was it late last year, I think it was, came out and supported a 5% deposit scheme. Now, that should never have dropped below 20% deposit scheme for the simple reason it's allowed people to leverage too much into property. So if you've got a $50,000 deposit and the minimum deposit is 20%, the most you can pay for a house is $250,000. So the most you can be in debt is $200,000. If you've got a 5% deposit, the most you can then leverage up to $1 million, because 50,000 is only 5% of $1 million. So by dropping that minimum standard, and there's other macroprudential controls as well, we've inflated the price of houses even though earnings haven't increased. Now, the other example of where macroprudential controls has let us down is when Keating let capital controls into the country in 1985, or lifted capital controls. He also said that savings banks no longer have to just engage in the practice of taking term deposits and savings and then lending that out. They could engage in other speculative activities. So we saw the Victorian State Bank, for example, buy the Tricontinental Merchant Bank. As a result of that, the Tricontinental Merchant Bank lost a lot of money in the stock market crash of the late 80s. It went bankrupt, which then dragged the Victorian State Bank into bankruptcy as well, which then almost bankrupted the Victorian state government. Now, a lot of people have raised their eyebrows when we say we want to bring back a public bank and go, oh, but what about the Victorian State Bank? But the Victorian State Bank didn't collapse because it was engaging in banking, traditional savings bank practices. It was deregulated. So all those free marketeers, the reason why it went broke was because it was deregulated. And no one for a minute would suggest you get rid of traffic rules, road rules when you're driving a car, for example. It's the same when it comes to banking practices. I mean, if you want to attract grifters, there's no better place to attract them than the banking industry, right? So that's macroprudential controls. Now, the other thing is quantitative easing. So this is the third lever. We should be able to issue our own infrastructure bonds to build income-producing assets like dams, toll roads, power stations, in order to actually fund the infrastructure that we need for this country without having to borrow the money. So if we build a power station today for $1 billion and we go and borrow that money from offshore, that means the first $1 billion we make from that power station, we have to repay offshore. Add another 25 years interest at 4%, it means that we've paid another $1 billion in interest offshore. Now, this is the irony of it all. No one for a minute, neoliberal would never say, BHP can't issue new shares on a stock exchange to build a coal mine that was going to generate 15% return on equity. Why can't governments issue infrastructure bonds to build infrastructure that's going to generate a return on equity as well? We already have title over all the untapped wealth in this country. We should not borrow against that from foreign banks where we pay them to use their currency. So what Keating did in 1985, and this is going against the advice of his own former Labor Prime Minister, who was then Treasurer, before he became Treasurer, actually, Ben Chiefeley, in the 1937 Banking Royal Commission, said that the central bank should always control the volume of credit in the system. When we lifted capital controls in 1985, we outsourced controlling the volume of credit to private banks, foreign banks. And of course, they came into Australia and they did engage in quantitative easing. We went from $8 billion in foreign debt, this is the private banks, to $800 billion in private debt by 2008. That lifted the price of houses from 4 to 5 times earnings to 10 to 12 times earnings, sent two parents back to work. When there was the GFC crash in 2008, Kevin Rudd had to let temporary students or temporary visa holders buy houses, hence the creation of the university sector. So the university sector propped up the housing market, which props up the banks. So we've got all these big institutions basically shafting Australians to protect their own profits.
Yes, and this is something we've been seeing with the property price boom, properties accelerating much faster than wages growth, people more leveraged, the average duration of a mortgage increasing, the average size of the mortgage increasing, 2 incomes rather than 1 income, making it less and less affordable for people to actually get into the market. So what's your perspective on the current falls in property prices? Michelle Bullock said today that, well, that was something she was aware of, but it wasn't critical in terms of her thinking of monetary policy. For many people, though, the prospect of falling home prices is pretty scary.
Yeah, well,
that's right. Oh, you go, Robbie. Yep.
I was just going to say, we've gone out on a limb in our economy, and it's a real problem where housing's unaffordable. So it's actually good news in one way that house prices are coming down. But nobody can afford to lose the value of their home, right? Because all the eggs are in that basket. You and I, Martin, we've often over the years looked at that graph that was produced by Dr. Wilson Tsai to show how the bank lending went from 30% housing in about 1990, 70% business, and it completely inverted. It's now 70% into housing and 30% into business. Right. That's and without a public bank, we had a public bank in 1990. Without a public bank, this is where the private banks are directing all of their credit. It means there's virtually no other game in town. So whatever happens with the housing market, I'm more concerned about making sure that the Australian people know, if we implement what we're talking about, the Australian people know that there is other activity in the economy, productive activity, where they can get their economic security from, not just from whatever the financial value of their home is, right? We've got to change the nature of our economy, because right now it's just all the eggs are in one basket, and it's terrifying for people.
And can I just add to that, Martin? And the key to that will be, and the reason why we need to do that is the best way to deal with housing affordability is to increase real wages from making true productivity gains in the economy. So, we don't want to see the housing market crash. I mean, I think it's at about 2.5%. It's come off, from the top where it was a few months ago. Probably live with 2.5%, maybe 5%. You do not want to see people go into negative equity, and you certainly don't want to see a 10% drop either. That's way too much. Even though house prices have risen too fast. What we need to see, yet again, is an increase in real wages. Now, we can do that through some levers of cutting income tax, filling family budgets with childcare support and their superannuation. But we also need to deliver genuine productivity gains by getting businesses to become more productive through, if they have to pay less for energy, have better roads, and that they can become more competitive and get out. We want to get rid of payroll tax and get out of their roads so they can start employing more people, make more profits. Then we'll see real wages start to rise, and that's the best way. Look, let's put a cap on house price growth for the time being. We've had a healthy 30-year rise. No one's but we don't want to see those people that came in at the end, and they, of course, are always the younger people suffer. So, especially those ones with 5% equity, they'll be, they won't be far off negative equity now. But we don't want to see them go into negative equity because if on top of this, if we did have an unemployment crisis where unemployment jumped to 10%, that's where you really start to see the pain hitting, because people will then default on their mortgages. So the name of the game here is that, we've got to start getting businesses and the economy moving in a productive sense again.
Well, it's interesting because Tim actually put a question in beforehand, which was about productivity. The Australian measure of productivity is extremely low. And in fact, in the latest statement of monetary policy that came out today, the RBA's down forecast it yet again. And without productivity growth, we can't get wages growth. We can't make the economy fire, other than continuing to bring more people in through high migration. So Tim's question was, how can you improve productivity? And is migration a positive or a negative in terms of productivity growth?
Well, partly we've got to go, not partly, in a big way, we've got to go back to basics. When you hear economists talk about productivity now, it's all tied right now that the zeitgeist, the trend, what's in vogue is talking about productivity in the context of things like investing in AI. And so you've got all these data centers, et cetera, being built. But an economy is what is how we organize ourselves to meet our needs, right? And our needs are, food, clothing, shelter, transportation, communication. And those are really basic. They'll always be our needs. There's not going to be a world in which we don't have the needs for those things, however fancy the internet gets. And we need better infrastructure to be able to meet those needs. And what happens is, I was looking at this the other day, because back in the 90s, our party used to work with this great old engineer, Lance Endersby, who was the Dean of Engineering at Monash University. And he got involved in promoting infrastructure projects because he'd worked on the Snowy Mountain scheme. He'd worked on Tassie Hydro in the 60s. He'd worked building dams in Southeast Asia. And when he was a professor in the 90s, all of his students were doing commerce degrees as well as engineering degrees, because they didn't think they'd get a job as engineers, because at that time, our investment in infrastructure had fallen from about 6% GDP in the late 60s to 2% in the 1990s. Now, if you look at the figures, the percentage of investment in infrastructure has gone up again, but it's not that kind of nation-building infrastructure, big power stations, big projects like the Snowy Mountain scheme, et cetera. It's all this catch-up infrastructure in the capital cities, which is catching up, roads and toll roads and things, catching up for overcrowded cities, right? And it doesn't have the same productivity improvement at all. So we need to do that. And then I think, because we've got to get immigration under control, that's for sure. What we've seen in the last few years is out of control. But if you actually start developing Australia properly again, you can easily absorb the immigration that we get, because people will want to go to where the jobs are, and the jobs should be in developing this country properly again and boosting our productivity that way.
Yeah, and if I could just add something to that, we need to get back on the tools. So we have financialised too many industries that don't actually produce any, untapped wealth, create value in the sense that it's going to. So you've got to go back to, I mean, I was taught this in grade 8 social sciences. You've got primary industry, second industry, tertiary industries. We've still got quite a very strong primary industry, and if anything, mining has probably partly caused some of the other issues in the sense that it's sucked a lot of tradies out of other industries. But we need to build a secondary industry, a manufacturing industry. Now, we willingly destroyed that in the 80s and the 90s, and that's where big part of where we went wrong with the button plan and lowering tariffs, right? Despite the fact we're more than happy to let profits go offshore at half the rate they're taxed here, which is actually a reverse tariff. So one of our policies is to bring back the military apprenticeship scheme, because I've been talking to people, I'm getting a lot of positive feedback on this. Employers today, especially in the building industry, they're going broke. So often an apprenticeship will start off with one employer and they're lucky to finish with the same employer. So we want to underwrite the entire apprenticeship scheme, at least to the extent that we can. So we want to charge foreign students, we will bring that down to 300,000, charge them $20,000+, raise $6 billion. At $60,000 a year, that's 100,000 apprentices you can train back on the tools, right? So we've got numbers around this as well. But because to build that infrastructure, you need people who can actually build things, right? So, and the other thing is we're going to crack down hard on gambling. There's hundreds of thousands of people in an industry that produces nothing. There's, too many people at universities. There's too many bureaucrats. A lot of these roles are in the service industries that are a cost centre. They're not a profit centre. So we're going to focus, we're just going to go back to basics and get younger generations, train them how to be on the tools, bring back the trades, and get them building that infrastructure that will generate the recurring revenue.
Yeah, very interesting. And the recurring revenue things, I think, are pretty important thematic. And just to be clear then, your policy on migration says what?
So our policy is we want to cap permanent visas at around 100,000. We want to bring student visas down to 300,000 from about 1 million it's estimated to be at the moment. We are going to remove the migration and mobility agreement with India. We think that, given that India has a population 70 times the size of Australia and most of the migration is all one way, we think that, that should be stopped in order to, and Indians are still welcome to apply for a visa. But I just think that's just a one-way agreement that doesn't work in the best interests of Australians. And we're going to link the tax file number. So when you get a visa, you're going to be getting a tax file number, because yet again, the major agencies involved with immigration don't talk to each other: Home Affairs, Immigration, Treasury, and the tax office. So we're going to actually get the tax office to track, people who come here on work visas and student visas. And if they, and also the expiry date is going to be attached to that visa. It's going to be with the tax office. And if the sponsoring employer or the university, if that person is still being paid or getting degrees or whatever, or receiving money, so we will also have to track universities by the payments they're receiving. So the student visas, when they're declaring their income, well, they don't have to universities, but they're going to have to lodge their income with the tax office, because we need to track what students there. And if they overstay, it's the employer, it's the sponsor, the employer, or the university that's going to pay a fine.
I must say that's one of the most coherent policies I've heard on migration from any of the parties, Gerard.
And look, it's not, I know some people want to make it all about race. The best way to deal with this is just increase the cost of the visa. You know what I mean? And keep increasing it until you get the visa number, the immigration numbers to where you want them to be, and use that money you raise from the visas to start training our own children. It's pretty simple logic. I mean, we're hopefully going to get our name approved soon to the Australian People's Party. And we'll still continue towards putting the Australian people first, and that's what it's all about. Is just making sure that Australians aren't. And look, as if we had our infrastructure, and I know there for a time we had an immigration rate of around 160, 180. If you could have the proper infrastructure built and Australians weren't going backwards, you could probably tolerate 160 to 180. But we'd also like to see the birth rate, our own birth rate here in Australia, increase again. I think it's down to 1.4. Get that back to 2. It doesn't, we're not going to sort of be too idealistic about that, but it's a sign of the times, the fact that people are having fewer children. And I think that's, going off on the deep end here a bit, when you come back to ethics and having parents around you teaching you right from wrong on a regular basis, day in, day out, I think that, going back to we were talking before at the start of the show about funding and things like that, we've really got to instill in people the gratitude that we have towards our own forefathers who've given us so much. We've got to instill in our own children that gratitude, and self-resilience, but also the ethics. I'm sure, our forefathers got up to things they never told us about. I mean, I don't tell my children things I used to do when I was 18, but, there's that, that I'm a big believer in that family connection to, raise children in the right way of knowing the difference between right and wrong as well, without getting too, sort of moralistic here. But there is something to be said for having, a family to provide a strong ethical base for people as well. So we want to see families get stronger and bigger again, without getting too, self-righteous about it or, yeah.
And just let me add a comment on that, because, if we can address this cost of living crisis, which is the biggest obstacle to people having kids, right? It is really crushing the cost of living crisis. That's what's broken the electorate this year. The cost of living crisis, it's just snapped it. If you can address that cost of living crisis, and if you can bring back some optimism for the future, that's a key part. You can't dictate to people, the women of Australia, how many kids they're going to have, etc. But if you can bring back that optimism for the future, so that families feel optimistic, you're going to get this natural increase in population back up again, I feel. I just got a little anecdote, because I got involved in politics quite young, and the founding chairman of our party, when I got involved in, I was recruited by his campaign for the seat of Hinkler in 1993. His name was Maurice Hetherington. When he got married in the 60s, he took his wife from Billawheeler down to the Snowy Mountain scheme to watch it being built. That was their honeymoon, right? That was how excited he was about the future of Australia at that time. How's that? Hey, Dale, this is our honeymoon. We're going to watch a big construction project. So we've lost that as a country, right? We've got to bring it back. And there's one statistic that I don't have the exact figures, but people are probably generally familiar with it, which really shows me how much we've lost our way, which is when you see the statistics of how reliant we are in Australia on foreign doctors and nurses. Now, God loved the foreign doctors and nurses, every single one of them, right? They're beautiful people. Thank God for them. But why are we so reliant on foreign doctors and nurses? We are a first world advanced country. Why haven't we trained enough ourselves? Why aren't we exporting doctors and nurses around the world, right? This is a real blight on our country. So we've got to turn that around, and it can be better for everybody.
Now, it's very interesting that you've touched on society and also family, because one of the questions that Joe asked was, we've got a larger proportion of youngsters now with various mental disorders. It's very, very high. Is that because of the education system? Is it because of social media, or is it something else? What's creating this massive problem that we've got, this actually intergenerational problem, she asks?
Oh, that's a big, broad, sweeping question. I mean, the range of issues there, and I don't pretend to be a mental health expert, to be honest, Martin. I mean, I could guess that, social media would play a part, your economic circumstances. Yet again, it's interesting. I came across this the other day. Winston Churchill suffered from depression, and one of the ways he actually dealt with it, and it was actually, I came across it when I was doom scrolling, actually, and he was very depressed because he got sacked from the Admiralty after the disastrous Gallipoli campaign, but he took up bricklaying as a way to deal with his depression. And as he said, the worst thing that an active mind can do, someone that's a deep thinker, is to continue to keep thinking. That's the worst thing you can do. You actually, opposite of thinking is to go and get active. And so he actually apparently joined the Bricklayers Association, and he was an active bricklayer. And he used that as a part of his therapy. Now, don't come to me for mental health advice, but, people need to be more active. If you're sitting in an office all day, and then going home, sitting in the house all night, you're on the phone all day, you're on public transport, and then you're back in your unit at night in a little dog box. I can't imagine that's the healthiest lifestyle either. Whereas at least if you've got a house and a backyard and, you've got some children, you've got to get moving. When you've got kids, you haven't got time to feel sorry for yourself because they keep you on your toes. And I know personally, like I didn't get married till I was late. Having children's given me a new sense of purpose. And, like I said, everything I do now, I see it through their eyes. So, so yet again, these are all big, broad sweeping statements and none of them are necessarily right or wrong. But, being active, being outdoors, having a family to give you a sense of purpose when you get to a certain age in life, they all, contribute to, I guess, as Robbie said before, giving you hope, giving you a vision and giving you the satisfaction. As Winston Churchill said, again, it was one of these multi-paged things we had to slide to the left, but he, just seeing that you're building something gave people a sense of satisfaction as well. And I think, that's the thing, if you're working in a paper shuffling, and I can relate to this because I grew up on the farm and, whereby, real things were done, fences were built, cattle were mustered, sheep were shorn, et cetera, et cetera. You could see the product of your labour, whereas when you worked in an office and you're just shuffling paper and you're reconciling intercompany accounts, there wasn't a lot of satisfaction in that other than being paid. So, you do want to, and this is what I mean, like, I think if we got more people back on the tools and they could actually see what they were building, and they were building big dams and big power stations and providing a better future for their children, I think they'd feel a lot better themselves. The whole world today is driven towards guilt and self-pity as well. We've got to feel guilty about our parents' past or, our forefathers' past. And I don't want to get too much on the cultural wars, but there is an industry, a grievance industry out there designed to, make you feel guilty and lower your self-esteem, and that's not healthy either.
Yeah, very interesting. Go on, Roy.
Well, I want to add to that because I remember, look, young people today have been through they've been through one big shock at least. The wars that they hear about in other parts of the world certainly don't help their mental health, I'm sure. But they went through the big shock of COVID, which was a big shock, and that wouldn't have helped. But I remember in COVID, I have a friend who actually works in mental health for young people, and there was all this concern about the mental health of young people. She observed to me that in her experience when she's counselling these kids, it was much bigger than COVID. And one of the things she identified, which is has been this permanent crisis that young people have been subjected to for 20 plus years, is climate catastrophism. This sense it's the end of the world. That does not help anybody at all. It's rubbish, but young people are especially susceptible to it, and that's what she was seeing. And she wasn't any kind of skeptic. She just knew that kind of messaging had been really damaging. And so there's different things you can hypothesize about. Whatever the particular cause of mental health problems, I will say this: I do reckon that a cost of living crisis makes everything worse. Whatever it is, that stress that comes in especially on families, etc., it always makes things worse. And I want to back up what Gerard said, quoting Churchill. I've been nerdy all my life, read books, etc. My older brother always picks on me because I got out of a lot of work because I read a lot of books, and he had to do all my chores for me because my father thought I had potential because I was smart. To this day, my greatest sense of accomplishment is, apart from having a great wife and kids and whatever, is when I was 14, we took a year off school, so our family built a house ourselves out of cement blocks in Queensland. And we started from scratch. We laid the blocks ourselves, and we finished it all. And to this day, that's still my greatest accomplishment in life. I built a house once.
Congratulations. It's a great sense of achievement, isn't it? And
sure.
I think that's very good. Now, here's a question that's just come in, which is very interesting. What's your stance on the digital ID, government overreach, security versus personal liberties? Very important question.
Well, he's asking for Gerard's stance. I'll let Gerard answer it because we have the same stance.
Well, look, obviously we don't want government overreach. It's got to be voluntary. I voted against the bill, and tried to, when it came in, because of my scepticism towards it, trusting the government not to use it, in a way, where they'll eventually start overreaching into people's personal lives. I have no doubt this is a matter of time. I think the really big issue will be currency, digital currency, and the controls they can put on you around that. I would say, on the other hand, though, if you think that if you're really worried about this stuff and you're serious about it, get rid of your mobile phone and go off the grid. Because if you're on social media, if you've got any sort of phone, even your cars today, I think a lot of cars can track your location. It's here. And the question is how we control it in a way to make sure that the big corporations and big governments aren't abusing our privacy. Look, obviously the answer to that is accountability and transparency. Do I have much faith in that? Absolutely not. So that's my thoughts on it in a nutshell. Obviously, if we ever got into power, we'd try and make sure that it wasn't used, or we wouldn't make it compulsory. The problem is you're up against, it's a bit like other things. Some people thought it provided greater privacy protection. So for example, if you're buying a house, or your rental agent, for example, you don't want to give them all your personal details, you can just give them some sort of, I forget how it worked, token, and that would verify. The real estate agent didn't get to see private information, but by giving them a certain token, it basically said these people were verified. So, there's pros and cons. I'm personally, look, I'm skeptical that it's not going to be used for government overreach one day, but all you can do is call it as you see it when it occurs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's the issue. It's the creeping nature of it. So, but I do think we've seen a couple of examples in recent years where, because the public has pushed back, governments have backed off on what their more utopian plans in this area. One of them was we've got some real pushback on cash, right? And so now we have everyone in Parliament gets up there and says, yeah, we want to protect cash. Not that long ago, they were all happy to say, oh, we're going to be all digital and whatever. Now, no one ever wants to be seen to be saying that, right? Because they know the public is very suspicious. Doesn't mean they're not letting the banks still do their dirty tricks to make cash hard to get, right? But at least from the standpoint of public policy, we've been able to push them back. And I do think when the digital ID came in, the government went out of its way to say, no, this is not going to be compulsory. It's only going to be voluntary, etc. And so it comes down to your level of trust that, as Gerard was alluding to. But what we have to guard against is so the government won't say it's compulsory for everyone to have a digital ID, but then programs get rolled out, and I'm even seeing some in the private sector where, in order to participate, then they start saying, oh, you've got to have a digital ID for that.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the creeping nature of it. And this is where there's no way around not having good people in Parliament to fight back against it. That's the key.
Right. Thank you for that. Now, another question that's come in, very important one, energy. Tim threw this one in as well and said, look, we're paying a lot for energy in Australia. The big gas companies are taking a lot of the gas out and making huge money internationally. We're paying international prices. We seem to be paying a lot for electricity. The whole energy story for Australia seems to be one of the reasons why our productivity has fallen through the floor.
Can I'll start with this, and Gerard will have plenty to say, I'm sure, but I want to just repeat this thing I told Gerard and I recently did a meeting down in Gippsland, right in Traralgon there, where one of the big brown coal power stations is. Back when Albo first got elected, then in June, I think the next year there was an energy crisis in winter, and so as part of looking at that, I did some research. In 1992, the Productivity Commission was ordered by Paul Keating to do a report into Australia's electricity system. And when you read it, you just fall off your chair, because it concluded three things. That it says we have the cheapest electricity in the world. That's true, but there's three problems with our electricity system. One is overcapacity. We produce too much. Two is overemployment. We employ too many people. This literally said that. And three is, and this is the worst sin for a neoliberal, cross-subsidisation. that people in the cities were paying a cent a kilowatt hour or whatever it was more, so that people in the country areas could pay a cent a kilowatt hour less, where it takes more power lines to take the electricity out to fewer people. They were the three problems that report identified. Who today would not trade in our whole electricity system for that system with those three problems, right? And what was the solution that they said? We've got to corporatize and privatize. So that tells you something right there. We can reverse that in different ways. You can't reverse everything about it completely, but you can see where you went wrong. And let's actually go back to having a functional electricity system and a proper energy system. And that begins with building more infrastructure, including power stations, real ones, base load ones.
So does that include nuclear?
Absolutely.
Right.
Jared, do you want to?
No,
Jared,
nothing to add, Robbie. I think you nailed that. I think that's pretty much my sentiments there. Build it and I'll come.
Yep.
Very good. All right.
And you'll make it much cheaper.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, well, here's another question then. AI. Thoughts on the newly announced Royal Commission on AI data centers? Is it for our benefit or theirs? What do you think?
Well, any Royal Commission, it's, I won't say it's a whitewash, but they don't necessarily, I'm not a big fan of Royal Commissions. Look, the issues with AI is where they're going to get their water and energy from. We've got to obviously look at replacing the jobs that AI will take in the service industry. And we've got to look at who's actually writing the AI, because we don't want Big Brother telling us what to think. So there are three issues there that we've got to deal with. We've got a policy where AI centres have to source their own power and water. That they can't be taking, because we've already got expensive electricity, step one. I'll add in there, inverted commas, the entire environmental aspects to that, which will, be huge. And then, the other big thing is, what jobs will it take? And yet again, it will take service jobs. So this is another reason why we need to get our young people back on the tools, because even, notwithstanding that we have financialised too many service roles in the economy, the best way to deal with AI and avoid being impacted by it is to get in those jobs, mechanics or whatever, where you can't automate the roles. We've got to live with AI. Look, if you don't get on board and get in front of it, we'll fall behind. So we do have to accept that it's a reality of the world we live in. But they're the big three issues. And look, I won't pretend to be a mega expert in this, other than, let's make sure that our children can, learn skills other than just service roles, as we pointed out. And, we've got to make sure that they're not basically, screwing the people in terms of using the energy and the water that we're otherwise got access to. So, yet again, I don't know how the Royal Commission, look, it'll obviously, to be fair, the Royal Commission, if it's done well, it can probably highlight issues and hopefully it'll interview people that can, provide solutions. That's, I guess, our view on AI.
This is one of those issues that we're playing catch up with, because it's moving so fast, etc. And so I also don't pretend to be any kind of expert. People come to me with their views, etc. I've just been in an interesting discussion about some of this today. One person put it to me that we need to think about a sovereign AI capability, which is an interesting idea. And what he meant was, if you just have a lot of data centers in Australia, and Australia has become a boomtown for data centers. There was more money invested in data centers in Australia last year than there was at the height of the mining boom in 2011, I think. So it was $300 billion invested. So that's big money going into these things. But if you just build a lot of data centers and you've got these foreign AI platforms that are harvesting our data, so then what we instead of us owning the platforms as well, or at least a platform for ourselves, then we are being harvested. Was his argument. our data is being harvested for profit overseas, and it's like the online equivalent of mining. We're being mined, and all the profits are going to go overseas. So this is interesting stuff to learn, and then to think about. Okay, well, in principle, that when that's put to you that way, you don't like that idea. What can we do? But the actual technological aspects and understanding that is quite advanced. So I'm not an expert on it, but maybe this Royal Commission will shed some light on that. So let's hope.
Well, maybe we'll just have an AI agent who actually books a gym appointment
Explain
and kicks a few other people out, right? Yeah, interesting times.
And that's a good point to make. Like every threat, there's usually opportunities, and we do want to make sure that, to the extent that AI centres are built here in Australia, that we at least benefit from it and don't lose from it, like we seem to do with every other part of the economy.
Yeah, there's a bit of a theme, isn't there, that we do seem to lose. So one of the questions that came in beforehand, this was from Jean. She was talking about the big deficits in the States. She was thinking particularly of Victoria. And to what extent is the decisions taken up in Canberra effectively irrelevant, because a lot of the real issues are actually down in the States, and some of the states and what they're doing. Is there a question of the relationship between the states and federal government? Does that need to change?
Absolutely. There's nothing, I touched on this in my maiden speech, there's nothing more damaging to this country than the vertical fiscal imbalance and the ambiguous responsibilities between state and federal governments. We don't need 9, if you include the federal health bureaucracy, increasing health bureaucracies whilst maternity wards shutting down in regional towns, right? So the whole state, federal, I'm glad you asked this, was a Jean, because I think this is a really important part of our way of life, our government structure that needs to be resolved. We believe, I actually personally don't think the state governments can get out of their mess they're in without federal government intervention. Our infrastructure bank is one way that can start to fix the problem, because we will fund the state governments the money to build the infrastructure, right? Now, they will then pay interest on those bonds. So, for example, it costs $1 billion to build a power station. It might take 4 years to build that. We won't just issue $1 billion bond. We will issue be an ongoing facility that increases by $5 million each week until it hits $1 billion after 4 years. Now, the interest paid on that bond will come back to the infrastructure bank. It will then make a profit. The profit from that bank will then go in a development bank, as will the profit from the National Government Insurance Office, as will the profit from the public bank. And then this bank will be called a development bank. And it will then re-lend to state and governments to build schools and hospitals, and councils to build sewage works, right, at a very low interest rate. So what we're effectively going to do is, and then from, if there's anything left over in terms of profit, after the cheap interest rates, which there should be because we're issuing our own credit, well, then that money can be redistributed to the states in the government grants. But we need, so what we're doing here is eliminating the cost of interest from their balance sheets in terms of profit centre infrastructure, and we're building them new assets that will start to generate recurring revenue. And this has all been done before. We saw it here in Queensland. Queensland was very much like Victoria in the late 50s. The national government got in and they started opening up the Bowen Basin, where they built coal mines. They charged BHP Mitsubishi royalties on that coal. They got BHP to build the train line, and then basically Queensland, and the BHP had to give it to the Queensland people effectively. So we collected freight charges from the train lines, and then the ports were built, and we collected port charges from the ports. We went and rinsed and repeated that with the bauxite deposits in Weipa. Except Leo Hilscher, genius that he was, said to Comalco, you can't export bauxite, you can only export alumina or aluminium. So that then had to be taken to Gladstone, where we added value to Gladstone and created jobs there, right? So we need to get state governments back to building infrastructure. If we do that, they will start to generate recurring revenue. We can fund that because we're responsible for currency, not foreign banks. So we want to make sure that rather than paying state governments paying interest offshore, they pay interest back to the federal government that we just give back to they pay as interest, but then we give it back to them as a dividend, let's bring back the golden casket, for example. Why on earth did we privatise that? So we need to look at those profit centres that state governments used to own, because in my view, that's where they went wrong, was that they privatised, they started it when Kenneth, it wasn't Kenneth's fault that Victoria was going broke. I blame Keating for that. But yet again, we need to, get state governments. But yet again, we need to streamline. We don't need two lots of health departments in this country. I personally would like to see the back end of health departments go federal, whilst the front end gets managed by, so here in Brisbane, we have Metro North and Metro South. Let them just run hospitals and take the state governments right out of it. Likewise with education, we want to push that back down to states, and ideally, I'd have super regionals tomorrow if I could. But education is a competition of ideas, right? We do want genuine competition and different ideas, because people in Mackay, for example, we don't want to be. They're not going to teach their children that coal miners are bad because their parents are coal miners, right? Or that farmers are bad. Okay. But whereas when it comes to health, if I'm bitten by a big black snake out somewhere in Western Queensland, I'm not picking up the phone and looking for the cheapest hospital across Australia. I'm going to the nearest hospital. Likewise with a sugarcane farmer in Mackay, if Wilmar, screws them around, that's foreign-owned Singapore company. Sugarcane farmers can't afford to take their sugarcane all the way up to Townsville or Ayr, for example. So, those areas where there's no elasticity of choice, and this is the problem with the free marketeers, they assume perfect markets, and there's no such thing as a perfect market. You've got to actually have genuine elasticity of choice to have genuine competition, and you've got to have genuine risk, right? So yet again, whereby we have big governments risking taxpayers' money, big corporations risking shareholders' money, or big super funds risking supers' money, members' money, they're not taking a downside risk. They don't look after it with the same care they'll look after their own money, right? Adam Smith, 1776, Wealth of Nations. I quoted it in my maiden speech again. So those areas whereby there's little elasticity of choice, but we can actually drive efficiencies in the delivery of services. So we don't need 8 payroll systems to pay our nurses in this country. We're only 28 million people. For example, why not have a national procurement system for our health where we start making hospital beds again? Hospital beds are very expensive. We import them. Why can't we make them here in Australia from Australian steel or aluminium, whatever they're made out of, rather than importing beds, for example? And if we've got 28 million, yet again, as a part of the development bank, let's go and, build us a couple of steel factories, and then we can start to, start off with the basic brisket steel, whatever, but then start to tailor some of these factories to build things like hospital beds, so the government can underwrite our steel factories just by producing this, items we need in here in Australia, like hospital beds. And that can extend to, government cars again, and things like that, whereby, instead of importing foreign-made cars, let's see if we can actually, if we're doing it on a national basis, population 28 million, and, let's not kid ourselves that we'll hit 30 million in the next decade. So, let's be ready for it by actually having the jobs and being able to create value here so that we can ensure that everyone is gainfully employed.
Right.
And just back to the states, Martin, and Gerard's alluded to this, but with the privatisation, the assets they sold were these money-making assets, right, where they could provide the service and cover their costs and even generate some revenue for the government. That's through the privatisation frenzy. That's what was all sold, and so those states and Victoria. It's not a coincidence that Victoria is the basket case economy, which also had the most aggressive privatisation program. Right now, a little while ago, probably about 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, there's an economist named Alison Pennington who did a report about how, if you look at the 2000s, the 25 years of this century so far, the things where we've had the most consistent inflation and the biggest price rises that's driven up our cost of living are the costs of those services that were privatized, right? Electricity, gas, and all those, and lots of others, health, etc. Things that were privatized are now much more expensive for us. So, it's just we've created this problem ourselves. And then last weekend, the Australian newspaper reported this. It was a shocking thing to me because the Australian public have well and truly turned against privatisation, but they got a hold of these cabinet documents from Victoria, from the Dan Andrews and Jacinta Allen administration, and they were actually talking about privatising Melbourne Water to help pay down our state's enormous debt, right? So it's a rinse and repeat of what Kennett did 30 years earlier. And they were trying to do it, think about how they could do it in such a way, because they knew the public would hate the idea. You know, it's not 30 years ago now. People have seen the disaster of privatisation. And despite knowing that, they were still looking for a way to do it. What got my attention, though, they put a price on Melbourne Water of $18 billion. It just blew my mind. Imagine having to build all of Melbourne's water infrastructure now for $18 billion. All right, that's what they were contemplating selling it for. Anyway, so it's lunacy, and we've got to get away from that kind of thinking entirely. What we're talking about is actually using the power of government institutions like a national infrastructure bank to bring back that infrastructure and those things that can make money for governments and stop them from being so much dependent on debt.
Absolutely. 18 billion. That doesn't sound much, does it? Here's a question specifically relating to the big four auditing and accounting firms. What can you do to control them or stop the government employing them to do the work of the public service? Big question.
Yeah. And, well, you know, without being a little bit facetious here, but, you know, I wouldn't need any of them because I come from the same background as these guys. The idea that Treasury have to rely on experts outside of industry. So if I was in charge, I mean, I wouldn't need any of them, right? I wouldn't pay them a cent because they're only giving advice. They're just giving, you know, inflated opinions. Yep. And the question really needs to be asked of Treasury, for example, in regards to, I think the tax office is paid, who were those guys again? I can't remember their names now. I just spoke about them the other day, something like a couple of $1 million, or it was a couple of billion actually. Why do these guys who I know, like I've come from the same industry as them, why do they need to employ other people in the industry to tell them how to do their jobs? Clearly they're not doing their jobs. So the easiest way to deal with these guys is just get rid of them. You don't need consultants. Anyone that I will remember, I worked for a bank and I won't name the CEO. He came in big swinging, dick. And the first thing he did was engage consultants who came in and said we have to outsource our banking mainframe. And I was like, hang on, isn't a banking mainframe the core part of the business? And I mean, as it turned out, it was good for me because I worked on the outsourcing process and ended up learning how about banking systems work. But it was absurd that it was the Bank of Queensland at the time decided to actually outsource one of its key functions. And yet again, it's privatisation, outsourcing. Outsourcing is just the privatisation of human labour, basically. But look, they are completely unnecessary to the extent that they're giving any advice on any form of consulting whatsoever. If you can't, I mean, we're running this party on the smell of Norley rags. So last night we were on exec meeting and I put out an email last night calling for volunteers to help in our marketing. Can you use Canva? Can you do digital ID? You know what I mean? Like we can't afford to pay people at all. Like this is, we want to be a genuine grassroots party. Everyone's got to chip in. It's not just standing on the side road waving a cool flute. It's right down to the nuts and bolts of running a party. And that's what Treasury should be doing. They should be able to. They are paid very well in the Treasury Department. And they should be able to do these things without relying on consultants. I'll stop there because I could keep going on about this for a very long time. But honestly, you don't need them. And it's a poor reflection on the lack of skills and aptitude of our ministers that they don't know enough to lean into the bureaucrats.
And my only comment on it, Martin, is it came to our attention a little while ago now. It was quite surprising because you tended to sort of be familiar with the big companies that funded the political parties and gave the big donations, and they include the banks and big names like Dick Pratt in those days, it's Anthony Pratt now, etc. But then suddenly, up pops EY, KPMG, PwC, etc., as huge donors to the political parties. And then when you see the contracts they're getting from every single government department, for some reason the Defence Department's the big one, but all government departments, and so they're donating a few $1 million to the two major parties each year, and they're getting billions of dollars back in contracts. And then you ask the question that Gerard's just touched on. It just seems really strange. The culture, it's sort of crept up on us, but there's a big backlash now because of the KPMG scandal, the PwC scandal, etc. So I think there's a really good opportunity to change that culture once and for all.
I would say follow the money.
Yeah, and just one comment very quickly, and I said this on the Mark Burris podcast a couple of weeks ago as well. You could get rid of 75% of the managerial class in this country and you wouldn't miss them. And that's a perfect area. Like, honestly, what do? The Defence Department employs a bunch of bean counters to tell them what to do. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So anyway, I'll stop there because I could go all night about this. Yeah.
No, it's a very, very important point. Now, here's an interesting one from Blind Freddy. What have you had to compromise from your original policies in order to come up with the merger agreement on the new party? And he says, love the conversation. Keep up the good work.
Well, not very much, actually. It's been quite. I mean, I met Gerard in 2019, and our first conversation, Gerard said, "I want a national infrastructure bank. I want to stop multinationals evading tax." And so 7 years later, and having worked with Gerard on a bunch of interesting things, including a very big and successful, successful in parliamentary terms, inquiry into branch closures. Also, read Gerard's maiden speech and all the different themes he touched on there. In fact, Gerard and I had a friend in the Greens. He died a few years ago, who was a bit of a bit out of the box in the Greens. He had some interesting ideas. This guy Fraser, he said to me one day, he sort of whispered, he said, "Oh, have you read Gerard Rennick's maiden speech? It's brilliant." I knew that we were well and truly on the same page. But when you're going into a party, you're not looking for absolute agreement on everything. You're looking for, can you trust this person or this group of people? Can you work with them? This is my view, do you have confidence in their integrity? That even if you might have a disagreement, you know that it's a different perspective that you're trying to resolve. It's not because, which I think would probably be a real issue in the major parties, it's not because that person you might have a disagreement with on something is basically bought by some vested interest who's influencing that agreement, right? Because that's where it gets really poisonous. And I think the major parties and all their factions and whatever, probably that's a really poisonous part of their culture. Where I have enormous confidence in Gerard's integrity and the fact that even if there might be some minor disagreements on different things, we can resolve them. We'll work out a way to express the policy we have to express. But then sometime in the future, when we might be in Parliament and be in a position to actually influence these things, right, that we know that we're acting on good faith at all times. That's how I see it, and I'm pretty confident we're going to be able to create that.
Yeah, and we've also got, I think both of us are passionate about economic reform. I mean, you've heard us drop the word infrastructure probably 100 times tonight. Look, I'm guilty of fighting the culture wars myself, I'll admit it, and they are important, but I genuinely believe the best way to win the culture wars is to empower families and individual to balance their family budgets. If people can buy a house by the time they're 25 because they've saved up enough for a deposit, have it paid off by the time they're 45 and retired by the time they're 65 and raise their children in that house, that is the best panacea for winning the culture wars as well. You just can't, shouting at people on social media about culture war issues, someone you never know, and isn't the way to solve these issues. The best way to solve these issues is get mum or dad up at the P&C meeting, P&F meeting, get them involved in sporting groups, and keep a close connection because it keeps empathy too. Because, there's people that I know have a different political view to me, but, it's important that we empathise with their point of view. And, it's in politics, it's all too easy to take a side and then forget there's another side. And I saw that in COVID, whereby, I was told to sit down and shut up, don't worry, the people are injured, right? People had lost all sense of humanity. So the other thing, look, with the Citizens Party, they've got good infrastructure. They've got paying members as well that pay a recurring fee every year. The other thing I liked, apart from the fact we've had common interests around the economy and infrastructure and nation building, is the fact that you've got an active membership, a very passionate membership. Because if we really want to make democracy work in this country, it's got to come from the people. And we can't continue to complain about the influence of big vested interests if we sit back and do nothing. I'm really happy to get the citizens on board. And we're already talking with other parties. We're not sure we will get them, but we want to try and merge with one or two other parties too if we can pull it off. Because we see the need to unite the right. We're keen to unite the right. And if you're from One Nation, you ask why we won't merge with One Nation. It's purely because Pauline is president for life. There's been attempts between Bob Katter and Clive Palmer to merge with her in the past. It hasn't worked. But we do think we should unite the right. We'd happily unite with One Nation if it was going to be a proper democratic structure, whereby we had a proper grassroots movement. But we're not there. They're now a major party anyway, so we're not in the same league as them, let's get honest. But certainly on the minor, every major needs a minor, and we want to make sure that we can become a minor party that can influence the majors, as we did. I mean, the whole narrative, for example, around that the banking inquiry, and keeping branches open, we turned that around in the time I was in Parliament. No one cared about that. That was a hot button topic. By the time we left Parliament, as you say, Rob, it's like cash. No one is ever going to come out now and admit that it's a good thing that banks are shutting their branches. So we want to, our first goal is to at least get into Parliament with the Senate and influence in a positive way that's going to drive outcomes rather than just be on the sidelines whinging, but actually losing the argument. So this is another thing. A lot of people think if you're making a lot of noise, you're a good politician. I disagree with that. It's whether or not you can win the argument and influence outcomes. And that's what we want to do. And, I'll bet you London to a brick in a year's time, there'll be major parties that will be talking, using some of our policies. I've got no doubt about it.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the questions that came in from 07 Cherry was, thank you, Robbie, Gerard and Martin, for a great conversation. We need more of this common sense and philosophical approach. How then do we rid ourselves of the self-serving uni party? And I think you've started to architect there in your answer, Gerard, some of the things that need to be put in place to be able to shift the dial.
Yeah, absolutely. We need a party, we need members. Obviously, we need money. We raise that through membership and small donations. And then we need to get our message out there. So that's, you don't have to be a member, but, spread the word on social media, spread the word through community engagements, and once we get the name sorted, we've been to a number of agricultural shows and field days. We intend to continue to go to agricultural shows and field days. We'll be over in WA in a couple of weeks. The field, what's that one called over there again? The field day over there, it's a big one. Darren Field Day. So community engagement, social media, and then word of mouth, friends and family. But, we've got flyers on our policies page of our website. We'll update the logo soon. We can do letterbox dropping. As I say to people, I would rather, instead of going to a rally in the city where I'm shouting at the clouds with like-minded people where we're just shouting in an echo chamber, I'd rather spend the afternoon letterbox dropping out in the burbs with our 5 key policies, and whereby people can actually see, okay, there's something in this for me, because that's where, and I think me and Robbie are pretty similar on this as well. We've both got, fantastic wives, happily married. We know that, the passion that families bring and the love, that's what's driving us to make sure that our children get those opportunities our forefathers gave to us. And the best way to do that is getting out in the burbs and just dropping off flyers even. And just talking to people, we do have branch meetings and they do tend to get a bit perfunctory after a while. But then occasionally, then we'll go to a field day or a show and people get a real buzz out of talking about policies. And that's where it's that community engagement. That's the best part of actually being in a political party. And that's what, we intend to do. Look, and all we can do is start to build that machine. And then we hope the success will come from building the grassroots structure that machine will hopefully give us, and then we'll that'll give us the platform to get into Parliament. And yet again, with One Nation, I mean, Pauline had 25, 30 years to get these branches up and running, and she didn't. And that shows she was never serious about getting rid of the uni party, because making slogans is not enough. You've got to run, like when you run a federal election campaign, you've got 150 different local campaigns, and you need a really strong grassroots movement on the ground. And you know, it's interesting. I know I was in Wagga last year, and I met a couple of local candidates who'd spent about 12 months door knocking and you know, campaigning hard. They were from Riverina. They got about 2% of the vote. You know, One Nation came in with a candidate from Queensland that got 9% of the vote, but didn't really shift the dial. You know, if you want to get to that 50%, you've got to be getting out there and campaigning earlier on. And you can't fatten a pig on market day. You've got to get out and start early. And we know that works because we've seen it with the Teals, whereby in the last 2 election cycles, they've gone from 0 representation in the lower house to, I think, 8 or 9 or 10 seats in the lower house. And they don't necessarily have a strong national leader or, you know, one national leader. They have a very strong, active grassroots movement in their local electorates. And they haven't tried to knock the lights out and go for 150 electorates up front. But they've, you know, as I say, all politics is local, and the Greens have actually shown us, the Teals. The Greens aren't bad at it either, but the Teals are actually, their campaigning methods is something that, you know, other parties should reflect upon.
Very interesting.
And Martin,
yeah, go on.
If I can just add, it goes. I think it, to answer the question about the uni party too. The uni party has never been this shaken up in history. This is unprecedented what's happening this year. But as you talked about earlier, there's certainly a sense of people voting against something, right? So what we're trying to show by focusing on economic policies is we've got to get the message out. Now there's a chance to vote for something, right? It's what you want. It will deliver the change that you want, but they've got to get the message, and that just takes effort. And if you're not going to get assisted by the media, we'll do it through word of mouth, do it through getting active grassroots involvement in the party, etc. And they will get the message, and they'll see the difference in what we're offering to what other parties are offering.
Well, we've hit, I think, a good time to finish the show. I want to say thank you to both of you. Robbie first. Where do they go now to find details of your part of the party?
Okay, well, this is all very temporary for now. So we still have our website up, citizensparty.org.au, and I'm generally available on social media at some variation of @Robbie Barwick. Little bit of a brag, Martin. I was telling you earlier, my discussion last week on getting people to participate in the post office inquiry. I got 1.2 million views across all my platforms. So I went mega viral last week by my standards, because it's an issue that struck a chord, not because I was extra persuasive. But that's available on @Robbie Barwick. What's going to happen is when there's an official switchover, if people go to citizensparty.org.au, they will be redirected straight away to the new People's Party website. So you can go there to see my side of the operation. I'll let Gerard answer for himself, but his website is going to end up being the main one going forward.
Okay, Gerard?
Yeah, Martin. So our website currently is peoplefirstparty.au. So you can hop online there and join if you want to. But we were on an exec meeting last night. We've currently got the People's Party sitting there in the background. We're just waiting to get the AEC to approve our name. And then we hope to have that by mid-September. And then we'll switch over to the People's Party website. But for the moment, it's peoplefirstparty.au. And then we'll streamline everything. So our IT guys at the moment are working on bringing both systems together. We're about to unify our database. And we'll have over 6,500 members, which I think is worth, pretty significant. Pretty significant. I mean, the Labor Party's got 50,000, but so we're within 2 years at least, People First starting, we're up to, a seventh of the size of the Labor Party. And we've had some strong growth in the last few weeks, and we're going on a national roadshow later this year, combined with our AGM, state AGMs, and we'll continue to promote our policies, because I think I've got feeling very optimistic from the last few weeks of podcasts including this one. I know you'll help as well, Martin. People are responding very well to the fact that we've got solutions and a vision. And, I had a conversation with a guy today who was just saying it's so refreshing to listen to a politician who isn't just spewing toxicity about the other side. And that's what, we want to do, is just focus on a better future for our children.
Well, that's the imperative. I always say, Gerard, the future is genuinely open. It is not yet set. There are things that could be done differently. And I think that's a really important vision point at the moment, because a lot of people I see in my surveys are locked into this doom loop, this doom loop of things. It's always bad. It's never going to get better. It can be better, but not if we do the same things as we've done in the past. We have to do things differently. And for me, I think the refreshing thing about this conversation was you guys have actually got some really important stories to tell. And I'm happy to help any way I can to help tell those stories, because I think this is really important and it's a great positive story for the future.
Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Gerard. Thank you very much, Robbie. I'm going to take you both offline now, and I'm going to close the show. I just want to say to everybody, thanks for watching, and check out the live show next week, which will be myself on the data list, looking specifically at mortgage stress and rental stress, those sorts of things. And check out the live show next Tuesday, and of course, each day we put a recorded show up as well. Thanks very much. Take care. We'll see you soon. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Take care.